Hello, everyone. I'm Amruta Byatnal. I'm an associate editor here at Devex, and today I'm really pleased to be having a discussion about decolonizing aid and the role of the UN. We're joined by three really interesting panelists today. We have Nithya Ramanathan with us, who's the CEO and co-founder of Nexleaf. We have Wale Osofisan, who's a senior director at the International Rescue Committee and is based in Nairobi. And we also have Ovigwe Eguegu, who's a policy analyst at the Development Reimagined from Abuja. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all of you for being here today. I'm very excited to be having this conversation with such a diverse group. And to start off, I'd really like to go to each one of you and talk about what the decolonizing aid debate, which has really picked up over the last year or so, has meant for you personally and in the work that you do. We've seen discussions on decolonizing global health, which obviously comes from what we're experiencing in the pandemic across the globe. But there's also a wider debate about what it really means to decolonizing the aid sector as a whole. And then we can obviously get to the role that the UN plays, what needs to happen going forward. And I'm really excited to hear all of you. So maybe, Wale, we could start with you and we can go around the panel if that's okay.
Yes, happy to go. Thank you, Amruta, for inviting me to join, this panel with Nithya and Ovigwe, to talk about decolonizing aid and to share some reflections on the aid system in general. I think colleagues and friends associated with the aid sector will agree with me that there are two critical events in the last couple of years that has placed this topic front and center of the aid agenda. And the first one is the unfortunate death of George Floyd and the impact of Black Lives Matter movement across the world. And the second is the fact that COVID has exposed some of the myths surrounding international aid, which makes this period the right time to seriously interrogate and deconstruct a lot of the practices in the international aid sector, including the UN, of course. But before I get to that, I'd like to state upfront three facts that we know to be true, or at least partially true, and not some form of conspiracy theories. So the first in my view is that we know that a lot of people who work in this sector got into it for altruistic reasons. People are determined and still are well determined to help people and communities in need. The second is that most of the money that is spent on traditional international humanitarian and development aid comes from, so-called rich countries in the West. I mean, the usual suspects: the US, the UK, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, France, and so on. And the third observation for me is this, and it's also a fact: the leadership and decision-making structures on how money is spent in the sector is mostly made by white aid workers and leaders who sit in fancy offices far away in places like New York, Washington, D.C., London, Geneva, Brussels, Stockholm, Paris, and so on. So generally, these are Western capital cities. And on top of that, the leadership of many international organizations, including INGOs and the UN, and so many other organizations that are associated with the aid sector, are actually based, in the global north, but the work is mostly done in the so-called global south. And most of the leadership of these organizations in the global south, tend to be white folks from donor countries. So therefore, when we hear a lot of the recent demands, to decolonize aid, because by its nature the structure is deemed to be colonial. So the COVID pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement has forced the sector to change and to rethink the way it operates. And I think it's safe to say that every donor organization, an INGO, and the UN is seriously looking into this issue, the issues of race, diversity, equality, and inclusion in its leadership structures, and how it designs and staff their programs. I'll stop there for now because there's a lot to share on what my organization, International Rescue Committee, has been doing to respond to this reckoning within the aid sector?
I'd love to jump in on that, if that's okay. While I agree with everything that you said, one of the things that comes up for me is it feels like in the mainstream that decolonizing aid is somehow a new conversation, but it's actually been happening for years, just behind closed doors. I myself have personally been in numerous conversations over the last 12 years that I've been in the aid sector, from the beginning, where these conversations around decision making and power, exactly as Wale was talking about, have been happening. I mean, it's no secret, especially to people on the ground, people in country, to ministries and government decision makers, where the power is. One of the things that we've seen ourselves, and I'll just add to what Wale was saying, rather than try to repeat it all, but one of the things that we've seen is, and as a data-focused organization, of course, we'll have this perspective, but we've seen that too often it starts with ownership of data and knowledge. And when that ownership of that data and knowledge is incorrectly placed outside the country, outside the community, from there, a lot of the power and decision-making and resources just flow from there. And so, to Wale's point, decision-making is so crucial. And right now we have people outside of communities and outside of countries who are making decisions about resources and programmatic priorities in a way that continues to just reinforce the colonial paradigms that we're talking about. One final thing that I'll add to that is we are talking about, when we talk about colonialist extraction of resources, which is part of this kind of repetition of these colonial paradigms. When we see how data is extracted from countries and communities, it very much repeats these kind of colonial extractions of resources. But what's ironic is that unlike things like oil, which are finite resources, where there was natural competition, things like data, knowledge, and learning, it's that much more criminal that these types of resources are being extracted from communities and countries and being held in silos in the West. Not only does it reinforce these colonial paradigms, but it's unnecessarily so. And so we think a lot about who owns the data, who owns the knowledge that's being generated, because from there, if you've got that rightfully owned in country, from there, we believe that the right decision-making and power and resources can flow from there.
When we were chatting earlier, you did mention that you've spent around 17 years in the UK and now you're back on the African continent. So I would like to, now talk about this idea of localization, which is also talked about a lot along with decolonizing aid. Do you think, people have finally started to make inroads in this idea of localization? The fact that you have moved is probably one indication of that. But do you see other examples of people like you?
So Amruta, first of all, I have issues with the terminology localization, right? Who framed that word localization? What does it mean, right? We need to define what we're talking about. If it means that, the global, the so-called global north is going to define what localization means, then I have a problem with that, right? But if it means that we are, as someone that works for an international organization, we are consciously aware of the power that we hold within the sector and ensuring that we're just not sharing that power with decision makers on the ground in places that we work, but they are actually at the driver's seat because it's their country, it's their context. They tell us what will work, then we come and provide that support. It has to be their agenda, not us defining the agenda from London or from New York or from Washington DC or Paris, right? They should be defining the agenda, and our role is to support that agenda. Then one thing I will also like to point out is there's this mindset in this aid architecture and aid business that those from the global north are kind of doing a favor, to people in the global south. I challenge that. We are not doing people a favor. We are providing a service. Even as an INGO, we're being funded, by someone to provide services, in places that we work with. So the accountability obviously has to be to those that are funding us, definitely, because it's their money, but there also has to be accountability, downward accountability to the people we're being asked to provide services to. So localization, who is defining the agenda? For me, it's a very simple principle. Who is defining what needs to be done, right? It has to be the people at the forefront of the crisis we're responding to.
I so strongly agree with that, Wale. I'm kind of curious what you'll think about this, but I'll share something that has been on my mind lately as we think about kind of righting these wrongs and shifting the power, rethinking these structures. So to Wale's point, that accountability is so important. And one of the lessons that I learned, so as an organization, we also manufacture commodities, we manufacture sensors specifically, and we compete in markets with other private sector companies in the manufacturing of those sensors. And it was really interesting to me. One of the other companies that sells into this space had asked me, why we've had the scale that we've had. And I asked them, who is their customer? And they said their customer was UNICEF. And I told them, my customer is the country. My customer is the Ministry of Health. UNICEF may finally be the one that cuts the check, but it's the Ministry of Health who's both putting in resources and their time, which is far more valuable than money. And I'm very clear about that. And my entire organization is very clear about that. If you ask anybody in my organization who our customer is, it is the Ministry of Health. It's written into our mission, it's written everywhere. And so I think to Wale's point about accountability, one of the things, and here's my question to you, Wale, is, and I know that this doesn't translate across sectors, but one of the things that I do think has been really interesting and valuable for us in really nailing down that accountability is that the Ministry of Health does put some money in terms of immunization. And so they kind of have, I'd say, some leverage to be able to demand that accountability from providers like us. And it's very clear to us that we are a provider of services to the ministry. And so I guess I'm wondering, Wale, because I know that IRC doesn't operate in the same space, we don't operate in all the overlapping spaces, but I'm curious from your perspective what you've seen in terms of the role of the Ministry of Health and country government financing in improving the accountability in that way, or do you think there's other mechanisms that countries have to kind of reinforce that accountability?
Absolutely. If a donor puts in $100 million or pounds into a health project, and the Ministry of Health has not put in a penny into that, it's difficult for the Ministry of Health to demand accountability from an organization that is providing services. But if the Ministry of Health has, even if it's as low as 10% in that project, then they have some leverage and they have a say in how the money should be spent. Now, there are two things we need to separate here. We need to separate humanitarian aid from development aid. Most development assistance, in most cases, not all cases, often go through the government system. So you might have a situation where, for example, the UN or the World Bank is funding a project with a third-party implementing partner, but that project is designed with the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Education based on their strategic plan, for the country. But with humanitarian aid, it's quite different because most, humanitarian funding is direct, service delivery, and that comes into play in cases where there is a critical gap, in the government system, or maybe in a conflict zone where the state has practically collapsed and the institutions are not functioning. But in my view, even in humanitarian aid, we should also, have room for what we call system strengthening, at the IRC. So where there is fragility, how can we use, the funding from aid, not just to deliver services and walk away, but also to, help put in place system structures, that will outlast the intervention that, we've brought into that society, which means that we have to work with, the local decision makers or power holders in that setting. The problem you often find is, in the humanitarian sector, there are the humanitarian principles of, neutrality, impartiality, independence, and humanity, which are good in principle, but sometimes I think a lot of organizations use it as a get out of jail card, not to work with local authorities, because they'll say the local authorities are compromising their independence. And I'll share an example of an experience I had. I wouldn't mention the donor capital in one of the Nordic countries. I was on a panel, and they were talking about Northeast Nigeria. And at that time, the Nigerian government was curtailing access of humanitarian actors into the areas that Boko Haram was operating. And a lot of humanitarian organizations, kept banging the drum of humanitarian principles. The Nigerian government cannot do that. And there was this French guy from a French organization that challenged me, because I was trying to make the case that, look, we need to have a conversation and a dialogue with the Nigerian authorities on what we're doing, what our mandate is and what their concerns are. At the end of the day, we want to, help people in need in those communities that were affected by the insurgency. And he challenged me by saying, why are we talking to the government? It's going to compromise our independence and neutrality. So I asked him, where he was from. He said he was from France. What part of France? He told me, and I asked him, do they face any form of natural disasters in those areas? He said, oh yeah, it comes from an area that gets flooded during the raining season in France. So I asked him, can a Nigerian organization fly into your commune in France and start responding, to people affected by flooding without coordinating with the French government? He said no. So I asked him, so what makes it okay for a French organization to walk into Nigeria and do whatever he likes without coordinating with the government, hiding under the humanitarian principles? What's that thinking behind that? Why is it okay for a French organization to do that in Nigeria, but the Nigerian organization cannot do that in France? So it begins to expose some of the deep-seated prejudices that a lot of people, in our sector, sadly, carry with them. In my view, we just have to be very pragmatic. You cannot go into someone else's country and dictate what you want to do. That's just not. It's not right.
We have Ovigwe back with us, and I'd like to go to you now. So we're talking about, what the idea of localization might look like. Wale did say he doesn't really like the term. Nithya shared her experiences about, what it means to actually go into a country and really engage with the ministry there instead of engaging with external organizations like the UN. So I'd just like to get a sense from you, what has your experience been like, and what do you think is the next big challenge as the development sector, the humanitarian sectors really, look to sort of face this hurdle going forward?
Yeah, so for me, when I look at the international development today, whether humanitarian aid or ODA as they call it, official development assistance, it's your topic decolonizing is really apt because it needs to be decolonized, and you just have to listen to Wale's example to know what exactly we're dealing with here in Nigeria and all across Africa. In fact, the entire global South, right? And in a colonial relationship, it takes two. There's a quote unquote colonize, or the junior partner, then the senior partner, and you see certain features in that relationship. One is infantilization of the colonized or the junior partner, where their voice is not really not respected, even within their own domain, and then in the global space is almost not even heard, at all. And I would also say, to a large extent, you would also find lack of ownership of the means of production. And that sounds very socialist, but bear with me, and you understand what I'm trying to aim at when I talk about this. Let's look at COVID-19, for example. when COVID-19 happened, there was a COVAX program. And also, you had a lot of talk about SDRs, as special drawing rights. And if you understand the special drawing rights, they are supposed to be one of the mechanisms to assist developing countries. That was how these mechanisms were framed and pushed for the whole world to say, okay, fine, let's go ahead with it. Now, the special drawing rights have been given. Do you know how many percent came to African countries, or at least the developing countries? For Africa, it was about 4.4%. That is very little. The amount of money we got from special drawing rights is not even enough. It's not even half of what African economies have spent on COVID-19 mitigation, right? So, and then even a very recent example, again, I would say that carries that feature of lack of, representation, I say, of voice being heard, is even Afghanistan, as we're looking at. As we're speaking to you now, 1 in 3 people in Afghanistan is food insecure, and then they are running out of medicines. Hospitals are about closing down. And what do we hear? That certain countries are freezing the assets of Afghanistan. Yes, I can understand the sentiments about women's rights and all of that. Those issues are very important to be taken seriously. But if you have a situation where people are actually dying from lack of medicines and they are facing severe hunger, is it really the time to start your own agenda in that country, or pushing your own agenda? For those in the global north, it is, because they don't really listen to the voices of the people on the ground. If you go to Kabul today now and ask them, do you think we should release the 9 billion that the United States government is withholding just to put pressure or as leverage against the Taliban? I don't think there's any Afghan that would agree to that money being held. Or the IMF is about $400 million they were supposed to supply to the Afghanis. They will tell you, bring those money because we need them. So whether in Nigeria or anywhere in the global south, the voices of the people on the ground are just missing from the conversation. They can platform these people in pictures and when they're doing photo ops, but when it comes to the real process, when it comes to the nitty-gritty, you will not find this representation. And it is because of the structure of the leadership. In Development Reimagined, we work on a program for decolonizing global health in particular. And then because of that program, we did a survey to find out about the leadership of most of the elites global health of NGOs. And what did we find? 16%, only 16% of senior leaders across all these organizations are from the countries they are operating in. That's very, very low. And 80% of them actually operate dual salary structure. So you have people being recruited from within their countries, paid far different from what they would have been paid if they had been brought from abroad to do the same work in that particular country. That is ridiculous. So there are a lot of structural problems, and I think that is where the conversation really needs to be at. How do we begin to change these structural, issues so that there is more? It's more inclusive. And I will bet you, if you cannot change the political dynamics in the global system as a whole, you would not be able to change the dynamics in the aid sector. The aid sector is just a reflection of broader economic, and hegemonic thinking from certain countries.
Right. Thanks for that, Ovigwe. Sorry, Wale, I thought you wanted to respond to Ovigwe first.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Ovigwe a question, because he raised some very, very, valid points. And, it goes back to, something I mentioned at the beginning. How can we in the global south expect to hold to account, donors from the global north, when even our own governments are not accountable to our people?
Yeah, that's
We might have
okay.
lost Wale there, but yeah, Ovigwe, go on.
Yeah, I think we don't have, we can't hold so-called global north countries to account because people here did not elect them. So we have to understand that they have the means, and it goes back to what I was saying about the means of production. They own the money, and they are the ones funding this program. So automatically they believe that they should have a say on how the money is spent, regardless of what the people on the ground think is priority, right? So that's the major issue, and that's why you would find there is this new discussion. I don't know if Devex is part of it, but they're calling it global public investment. One of a friend of mine, Jonathan Glennie, is working on that. He had a book out, and he's talking about how to rethink the way international development is structured, going from donor aid, relationship to have a more inclusive approach where everybody funds and everybody decides what the priority is. For instance, if we had that kind of system in place and we're looking at how to address COVID-19, it won't be rich countries donating vaccines to poor countries. It will be everybody sitting down to say, okay, which countries are the most vulnerable at this given time, and then which countries have the most resources, and then everybody pulls together and say we distribute according to the needs. But and again, it's very important that we begin to look at the aid sector from that perspective, where everybody pulls resources together, and then we all now decide how that money is spent, as opposed to the donor, recipient mechanism. Because now you have in Africa, for instance, just 2% of Africans have been fully vaccinated, but you have in Europe some countries already at 60-70%. Up until last week, Johnson & Johnson was producing vaccines in South Africa and shipping it to Europe. And you have people just around you here that are not even taking one shot, and some countries are already on booster shots already. So that's exactly what we experienced during colonialism, where there was no food or nothing here, and then you are shipping it out. India saw the same thing too with during World War II. No food there was a famine in India that was really artificial because food was being sucked out of the country and people were starving. The same thing we're seeing with COVID-19 here. A continent of 1.3 billion people, only 2% have been vaccinated. Meanwhile, vaccines being put together here is being taken out of the continent, to Europe. And it has to be, you have to look at the way the African Union and African CDC are responding to that and say, you know what, we have to shut this down. And even Europe is saying they are going to send back those vaccines because they realize how ridiculous it is. But the very idea that was okay in the first place exposes all of the issues that is wrong with the current international development, space.
Right. In so many ways, the pandemic has sort of shown us a mirror. It has reflected the inherent colonial mentality. Unfortunately, we only have about 3 minutes left. So if we could just go around the panel and talk about how the UN fits into this discussion. We are at the UNGA, so it would be fit for us to talk about this a little bit. So maybe we could start with you, Nithya, and if you could talk about how you in your work can see engaging with the UN in a way that is not colonized.
Yeah, so for us, it comes down to recognizing that data is knowledge, is power, is money, and that in each step in that continuum, there's value, and being able to ensure that countries and communities are actually driving each of those steps. So driving whether and how we collect data, what data is collected, what knowledge is generated from that, how the decisions that are made based on that information, and then finally how resources are allocated based on those decisions. And if we can completely reorient, and it's going to require a massive shift, a lot of humility and introspection, I think we can get to the type of world that all of us panelists have been describing today.
Oh, should I go next? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah.
So with regards to the UN, I think we really need to take a step back, right? And, interrogate, the point at which the UN was founded in 1945, the dominant games in town was colonialism and imperialism. And the leadership structures and the operating model of the UN hasn't moved past 1945. So that needs to change. What I would like to do is I would like to leave us with a question, right? And it's a very, very pertinent one. So, and the question is this: how can the aid sector, whose founding roots were in the colonial era of imperial powers, how can the aid sector continue to contribute to international development without deepening the same power structures, attitudes, and behaviors that is partly historically responsible for the problems we're now responding to today?
That's a great question. Ovigwe, would you like to respond to that? And then after that, I'll just wrap up.
Personally, for me, I think saying decolonizing the UN is a bit of an oxymoron, and I think it goes back to what Wale was just saying. But for me, I think we can't do away with the United Nations. It's very important. The UN has been crucial in various ways, leading to global peace and security. We just have to accept that, and even if we have problems with it, that's the fact. But how do we solve the problems? I think again, it's about decision making process. How and who makes these decisions when it comes to global development? The Security Council is one of the easiest targets when you're looking at changing the United Nations. Why do we have the same people in the Security Council that we had, decades ago? What is the criteria? And for what reasons do we have the same members of the Security Council the way it is today? That the world has changed. The world has changed completely. So you have major countries who have the same, roughly even bigger economies than some of the countries in the Security Council making decisions. A country like United Kingdom, for instance, compare the population of the UK to India, and tell me how United Kingdom is more representative of the world as opposed to a country that had about 1.2 billion people. So it has to. We can't talk about inclusiveness in United Nations without interrogating the most crucial organ of the United Nations, which is the UN Security Council. And I think that's where attention needs to focus on. Yes, the UNGA is all right. We can still look at how we can accept that it helps in democratizing the process, but for the most critical issues in the world, the UN Security Council is the top body, and that is the target for decolonization. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for that, all of you. I've learned a lot today, as I'm sure our audience have as well. Listen to people, go to the people who really matter. Don't worry about terminologies and getting stuck in, sort of these discussions about what is right and what is wrong, but like really go to the people and get the work done is the message that I'm taking away from today. Thank you so much, all of you. I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.